Yes, good morning. It's Wednesday, the 15th of September 2020. Welcome back to the best On Ground Weekday Kickoff. It's my pleasure today to be welcoming back Sydney Morning Herald, Rugby League and Racing reporter Adam Pengilly. How are you, mate?
Morning, Pete. Going well, mate. Heading towards footy finals, not too far away, in spring racing. Love it. Love this time of year.
Mate, it's a fascinating time of year. There's some great storylines in all the different football codes at the moment, and we're looking ahead to the Everest and the Spring Carnival, as you say. So we've got plenty to talk about. We are going to start in Rugby League with a story from yourself this morning in the Sydney Morning Herald. You've carried some quotes from Graham Annesley, the NRL's head of football, who's claimed that he's taking a proposal to the Australian Rugby League Commission this week to change some of the processes for bunker officials to make calls. This comes off the back of what should have been a try, in Annesley's words, every day of the week for the Sydney Roosters against Newcastle on the weekend. But the decision was the try was disallowed after Nat Butcher was ruled to have impeded the Newcastle defence, despite standing almost motionless after playing the ball. Annesley hasn't gone into any great detail about what these changes are going to look like, but he assures yourself and the readers of the SMH that he's going to push something through nice and quickly, because he wants to make sure we get that bunker situation right as we do head into finals. Off the back of last year, Adam, and the six again in the grand final, how critical is it that we don't have another NRL final series dominated by talk about officiating?
Yeah, it's huge, Pete. After last year, particularly the grand final, as you mentioned. Listen, my personal opinion is I tend to cut the on-field officials a little bit of slack in terms of some of the mistakes they might make. They're in the heat of the moment. I can understand why sometimes decisions get made, but I think we've had far too many decisions being made wrong coming from the bunker this season. We've seen a horrible sin-binning of Bailey Simonson going back a couple of months ago. That Matt Duffy one with Jack Williams in that Cronulla Dragons game had a huge effect on the Dragons season, when clearly Duffy grounded the ball before Jack Williams got to it. The bunker got that one wrong. And this one is arguably the worst of the lot on the weekend there with Lindsay Collins. So Graham Annesley's keeping his cards very close to his chest in terms of what he means by shaking up that process in terms of what happens in the bunker there. But he's saying that we cannot accept any more of these decisions. They need to get them right. So he'll take a proposal to the commission there later this week. Hopefully, he'll be in place, his new process, before the Thursday night game between South and the Bulldogs. It's something the game cannot afford. We don't need any more officiating errors throughout the finals, and heaven forbid it costs the team their season.
He's been in a sense, a breath of fresh air since he took on that role, and he's prepared to front up every Monday and talk through decisions from the weekend, and he's prepared to acknowledge when decisions have been made incorrectly. So I think credit to Graham Annesley and the process that the NRL have got in place there. But on the flip side of that, is it a bit strange that he's not willing to go into any more detail about what this shake-up entails?
Well, I think he wants the commission to sign off on it first before he sort of talks about the proposal that he's put forward to him. So, yeah, I understand your point. It was a little bit strange yesterday saying we need to change that process sort of in-house or behind the scenes without saying exactly what was on his mind. I can understand where he's coming from, but it's more that process. And as he said yesterday, most people would have no idea what goes on in the bunker in terms of coming into a decision. All the general public want to know is, was that decision right or wrong? And they want the right decision. So hopefully, as he says, most businesses change their processes every day. This is just another process the NRL is trying to change. And let's hope they can get the decisions right from now on leading towards the end of the season.
We stay in rugby league for our second story today and head to friend of the show, Brad Walter from NRL.com, who's done a bit of a deep dive into the West Tigers, their roster situation as it currently stands, and into the decision-making to part ways with club legend Benji Marshall at the end of this season. That's despite Marshall being in some really good form this season. We know he was dropped by Michael Maguire early on in the piece. I think he was about top 3 in the Dally M at the time, and that certainly surprised a few people. But essentially, the decision to move Maguire on comes down to the fact that the Tigers, with their roster, have already got a number of other playmaking options locked in. They've got someone like Josh Reynolds, who they've been trying to move on but haven't been able to move him to a new club. And ultimately, despite the fact that Marshall's played on fairly low wages for somebody of his stature in recent years, they just can't justify paying that money to keep another playmaker at the club. They've got to look to use that roster spot and that cash for other positions. Is this the right decision that the Tigers are making with Benji Marshall?
I'm sitting on the fence here a little bit, Pete. I can see why they're making the decision. I completely get why they're doing, given how lopsided their roster is at the moment. But by the same token, Benji is clearly in their best 2 or 3 halves in the club. And if he was playing again next year, he's almost a walk-up start in the number 7 jersey, number 6 jersey for the Tigers next year. The problem is, and Brad's story was great, I went through that in detail, is just how askew the roster has become with signing up these guys. There's a lot of halves and 5'8". They've got Luke Brooks under contract still for a couple of more years. Josh Reynolds, as you mentioned, they can't move him. Adam Dewey's probably wants to play 5'8". Whether that's his best position or not, I'm not too sure, but you can classify him as a half. Same as Moses Mbai. They've got a young kid in Jock Madden. Billy Walters is there on their roster. So the problem for the Tigers is they've just got too many halves under contract at the moment. And unfortunately for Benji, whether you like it or not, his deal runs out at the end of this year. Yes, he's on minimal money. Probably doesn't cost a whole lot underneath the salary cap. But the Tigers simply do not want to contract another half for next year, given how many halves they've already got in their books. It's a harsh business, Pete. We know that. It's brutal reality is that Benji won't be at the club next year. I still think he's in their best 2 or 3 halves for sure. We saw that last week against South. He was enormous in that game, apart from that kick he put in on the second tackle with 2 or 3 minutes left that went dead and cost them probably their last real attacking chance in that game. So I don't know whether he gets another contract, Pete. I'm not too sure. I ideally hope he does. There'll be interest from other clubs, I'm sure. Whether they're going to actually table an offer to him or not, I don't know. But the one thing that he's got in his favour is that the NRL is going to keep their top 30 contracting system. There was some suggestion it might be 28, even 26, but they're going to keep top 30, so there's still roster spots available at other clubs. It's just a matter of where they can find enough money to keep Benji going for another year.
Yeah, you would assume or you would imagine that, with those 30 roster spots, we still don't know what's going to happen with reserve grade competitions next year and whether they'll return to normal. So having young, untried rookies in key playmaking positions is probably not a situation clubs want to find themselves in. He does present possibly as a good insurance policy for a club, even if they don't see him in their 17 every week. I guess the question I would ask would be, if you're tossing up a decision between a 35-year-old Benji Marshall and Kieran Foran, who's got a few more years on his side but has had less luck with injury, which one would you be going for?
Oh, it's a good question. I've grappled with this the last couple of days, actually. I'd probably go with Benji, to be honest. Just give him 1 year. I'd still think Benji's football is probably a little bit more, not consistent than Foran, but he's on the field more regularly than Kieran Foran, unfortunately. Kieran busts his gut every single week, and he did put together a decent stretch of games this year, but he just keeps getting these, I want to say, freak sort of injuries or long-term injuries. He's struggling with a pec injury at the moment, won't play again this year, and his future's obviously still clouded. So I know Foran potentially could play for another 2 or 3 years, but I just think with Benji's ability to put together a large sequence of games, I'd probably still be plumping for Benji if you ask for an option next year. So we'll wait and see how that plays out. The problem for Benji as well, Pete, is just quickly is he doesn't want to go to a club that's not going to be challenging for a premiership next year. He's probably got 1 more year left in him. Does he really want to go to a Cowboys or a team like that they're not probably going to struggle to make the top 8? Does he want to end his career on that note? So I don't know. There's still plenty to play out in this space. I just hope he gets another deal for next year.
Yeah, you and me likewise. I think, as well, you've got to talk about the human element of, does he want to upend his family and move, from Sydney to Townsville and these sorts of things as well. Our third story today, we're going to switch to rugby union, and it's the Super Rugby AU Grand Final this weekend. We saw the Queensland Reds get the job done on Saturday night at Suncorp Stadium against the Melbourne Rebels. So they'll head to Canberra to take on a Brumbies team who've been the best Australian team for a good probably 4 years now. The Reds, this is their first final series in a long, long time, certainly their first one under Brad Thorne. And the Brumbies have gone the closest of the Aussie teams in recent years in Super Rugby. This year we've got the Super Rugby AU that's come in place because of COVID and the travel restrictions. And it's obviously a different competition that they would be winning if they were to get the Chockies on Saturday night. But do you think this weekend sees the culmination perhaps of 3 or 4 years of roster development, hard work, constant success, and really that the Brumbies need to get the job done to kind of crown what has been a good little period for them?
Yeah, absolutely, Pete. I think the Brumbies, as you mentioned, have been the most consistent Super Rugby franchise in Australia for many years now, not just for the last 3 or 4 years. You potentially go back to, I know the Waratahs and Reds have had success winning the competition, but going back to 15, 20 years ago in the early 2000s, it almost seems to me like that when the Brumbies are playing well, Australian rugby's in a reasonably good state, I think anyway. So it'd be fascinating to see what sort of crowd, as you mentioned, this week they get at Canberra Stadium, given the COVID restrictions. I think they're sort of aiming for around 6,000. Was that the number they're trying to get? The ACT government's going to ask. I I remember some of those Super Rugby finals in the early 2000s when the joint was absolutely humming. And even last year, I was down there at Canberra for the Raiders and Rabbitohs preliminary final, and having all those temporary seating and stands at the end of the grounds when it almost felt like you're a million miles away, but people were just clamouring to get a seat somewhere in that stadium to create the atmosphere. So I think the Brumbies do deserve to win this Super Rugby final there on the weekend against the Reds. That's taking nothing away from Brad Thorne and the job he's done with the Reds over the last couple of years, but I think it'd be a due reward for the Brumbies so they can get the chocolates there on the weekend and be rightly declared the best Super Rugby franchise in Australia.
Yeah, Caden Helmers in the Canberra Times with the story we've looked at there. And I guess the other thing the Brumbies would be able to do potentially is, and we don't know what Super Rugby looks like next year, but you'd love to see them get the job done potentially this weekend and then look to build on that if the competition were to return to a trans-Tasman state in 2021. Our penultimate story today comes from Richard Hines at abc.com. And he's had a really good look at Dominic Thiem's pretty remarkable win over Alexander Zverev in the US Open final yesterday. Of course, Zverev, the young German, raced out to a 2-set lead and looked to be serving for the third set when he was up 5-3. Thiem somehow managed to get back, win that third set, win the fourth, took it to a tiebreak in the fifth, which he won 8 points to 6. It was compelling viewing. It was fascinating to watch, and I guess for Thiem, who came into this tournament as the number 2 seed behind Novak Djokovic, once Djokovic got disqualified from this tournament, all the pressure was on Dominic Thiem, and it was a case of he'll never have a better opportunity to break his Grand Slam duck. He's managed to do so. He's 27 years of age, so it's not quite the new generation coming through. If a Zverev or a Medvedev would have won it, but has Dominic Thiem now earned his place amongst tennis's elite? And with the French Open coming up in a few weeks, we know he's played well there previously as well. Is he now a genuine, consistent Grand Slam threat?
Yeah, I'm not sure, Pete, about that question, to be honest. I think once Federer and Nadal and Djokovic is not hitting balls at lines judges and everything like that, Thiem is still going to prove it on a regular basis. I think, he's obviously been there and thereabouts for a couple of years now, but for mine, he needs to be able to produce that over 2 or 3 years of Grand Slams to be able to sort of elevate himself into that elite company with the Djokovic and Nadals and Federers of this world. So it was great to see him win. The one thing I want to say about that final there yesterday, I would have loved to have seen that fifth set go on for as long as possible rather than having a tiebreaker. I know this rule has been brought in gradually. I think it's been in the Australian Open, obviously, for the last year or two about having tiebreakers in the fifth set. I would have loved to have seen a 9-7, 12-10, 14-12, whatever in that fifth set. That would have been compelling viewing to me. So, well done to Dominic Thiem. We obviously sort of familiarise ourselves with those who aren't as au fait with tennis, with Thiem throughout the Australian Open earlier this year with his run throughout the tournament. It was really good to see that tournament finish in the US Open there with a fifth set cliffhanger, even though there was no crowds and only just a handful of officials in the venue at Arthur Ashe Stadium. So, for me, he's still got a little bit of work to do to elevate himself into that elite company. And did Richard mention, Pete, in that article that Thiem was the first male to win a Grand Slam with his birth date in the 1990s? That's a staggering stat.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. I mean, when you look at Naomi Osaka in the women's, she's born in the late 90s, almost the 2000s. And that's a phenomenal stat. That's really, really good. Good from you. And I like the call about, the non-tiebreaker in the fifth. I think, it's an attritional game. You've played 7 matches or you're in your 7th match. If you're in the final, you're into a fifth set, your body's telling you no. You can't turn away from that type of viewing if it had been able to carry on in that vein. And just one final point on the US Open. Well done to the organisers for getting it away. We didn't know how it was going to go. A lot of tennis players didn't travel, and completely understandable and justifiable. We had obviously a positive COVID test, the Frenchman Benoit Paire at the start of the tournament as well, and we weren't really sure how this was all going to play out, but they seem to have done an amazing job keeping that tournament secure and keeping people healthy and away from each other. And it's been really, really good to watch over the last couple of weeks. Talking of good to watch, our final story today, and any punters who are on the Queensland Rothfire in the run to the Rose on the weekend would have been very, very impressed indeed. Rothfire, an absolutely sensational triumph and really stamping himself as a clear contender for the $15 million Everest in 2020. And not taking away from Rothfire, there are obviously some question marks around Hugh Bowman and his ride on the favourite Farnan, who set out on a massive pace and really was in quicksand before the final 100 metres or so. But fantastic win for Rothfire. He's proven he can go into state and win away from home. We've also got the South Australian Geetra, who's managed to go to Victoria and be very, very impressive there. And Nature Strip is the favourite for the Everest. Based on current form, and we're having a look at an article from Mitch Cohen and RaceNet. Based on current form, though, Adam, is the Everest a 3-horse race between Nature Strip, Rothfire and Geetra?
No, definitely not, Pete. And judging by the way you introed that story, I'm guessing you had something small on Rothfire there on the weekend.
I might have had a little nibble.
Yeah, of course you did. Of course you did. Well, I was on Farnan, so you can imagine how I was feeling at the 200-metre mark when that horse was dead set, hit a brick wall. So, no, listen, Rothfire is a legitimate contender for the Everest this year. I don't think you can say anything otherwise at the moment, the way he returned in that run to the Rose. I think there was still a few little question marks about him coming out of that Queensland winter 2-year-old campaign when he won the JJ Atkins and measuring up against the better 3-year-old colts from Sydney. He's put those question marks to bed, no doubt, there on the weekend. He was aided by the pace that Farnan said. He was just in the sweet spot, second, carting up the rest of the field. And obviously when Hugh Bowman and Farnan had run out of gas at the furlong marker and were gasping for air, he was just there to pounce. So that race was run at an extremely solid clip. Usually when the races are run at that speed, the best horses win. He was clearly the best horse in that race. He'll head towards the Golden Rose now for Rob Heathcote and Jimmy Byrne, and we'll see what he can do at 7 furlongs and giving him a little bit of a freshen up heading towards the Everest sort of 3 or 4 weeks after that. But listen, Nature Strip's still the favourite for the Everest at this stage. He was beaten very convincingly by Geetra first up in that Concord Stakes, but I think as we've seen in the past, Nature Strip is a little bit vulnerable first up in his campaign. He's generally much better second and third up. I'm fascinated to see how some of these other 3-year-olds outside of Rothfire sort of measure up if they get a spot in the race. We're talking the likes of Anders. I'm not sure what they do with Farnan now. Geez, jury's got to be out on him after that absolute gutbuster first up. So, listen, to answer your question, those 3 horses are probably the top seeds at the moment, Nature Strip, Geetra and Rothfire, but I'm definitely not limiting the chances at this stage. I still think there's a lot of water to go under the bridge.
And we did see, also reported on RaceNet, the one punter's come in with 10,000 on Eduardo, recently shifted into the Joe Pride stable. So, interesting one there as well. Adam, fantastic to have you on the show, mate. We love catching up and looking forward to doing so again and again throughout what you say is your favourite time of the year from a sporting perspective. Thanks for being on the Best On Ground Weekday Kickoff.
Thanks, Pete. Enjoy the day, mate.
You too, mate. Thanks very much for watching and listening. We'll see you tomorrow. Darren Parkin.